Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it is a huge pleasure to welcome some familiar faces who have not been here for a long time, and I'm really, really happy to see you, and welcome to those people who have not been here before. Jews are so terribly alien to us. Their oriental impetuosity, argumentativeness, specific mode of thought, the set of their eyes, the shape of their ears, the winking of their eyelids, the line of their lips, everything. Next quote. It is true that Jews commit fraud, usury, and are involved in trade in human beings. Next. If we don't declare war on them, the Jewish rope will strangle us. And my fourth quote, Jews should not elect or be elected to the parliament, to the Senate, local government bodies. They should not be state or local government officials. They should not serve in the army. They should not be teachers in schools or universities. And just that last quote was said a week after Kristallnacht. None of these statements emanating from Poland in the 4 years before World War II came from Polish politicians. They were all uttered by Polish Catholic prelates, Polish Catholic priests, and Polish Catholic publications. And if you think that the murder of millions of Jews on Polish soil between 1939 and 1945 diluted the strident anti-Jewish attitudes among the Polish church hierarchy, well, think again. Here is Cardinal Chlond, the prelate who claimed that the Jews committed fraud in the quote I gave earlier. Here he is in 1945 after the Holocaust. The Jews brought the Holocaust on themselves because they betrayed Christ. 1997, 60 years after the call to ban Jews from government, here is Father Henryk Jankowski. There is no place for Jews in the Polish government. And a mere 12 years ago, in 2004, here is Father Edward Orlowski. The Jews are the cause for everything evil. Since medieval times, the Catholic hierarchy has fiercely resisted any attempts by Polish rulers to grant privileges to Jews in exchange for bolstering the economy. That's why Jews were invited in originally 900 years ago. Nevertheless, the Polish Jewish population grew, and by the 18th century, Poland was the spiritual center of world Jewry, with 80% of the world's Jews living in Poland. And yet, for centuries, virtually every church sermon in every church in Poland hammered home the message that the Jews had killed Christ. By the 1930s, the church in newly independent Poland was still obsessed with an anti-church Jewish Masonic conspiracy. Polish Catholic leaders explicitly encouraged anti-Jewish economic boycotts and routinely stigmatized Jews as Poland's spiritual and political enemies. Here is Cardinal Chlond again in 1936. It is a fact that Jews oppose the Catholic Church, are steeped in free thinking, and represent the avant-garde of the atheist movement, the Bolshevik movement, and subversive action. We get around. Church anti-Semitism was mirrored by the Polish government's own anti-Jewish agenda. 1919, newly independent Poland passed a law making Sunday a compulsory day of rest, a law clearly intended to prevent Jews, who were now 10% of Poland's population, from working on the Christian Sabbath. And throughout the 1930s, Polish legislation aped Nazi legislation in Germany. 1936, all Polish shops had to include the name of the owner on their business sign, tantamount to publicly identifying Jewish-owned businesses. 1937, legislation against Shchita, the kosher slaughtering of cattle, not only deprived Jews of kosher meat, but also had a devastating effect on the livelihood of tens of thousands of Jewish butchers and their families. The government encouraged schools and universities to force Jews to sit at the back of the room. 1937, the Polish Medical Association excluded Jews from the medical profession, and the Polish Bar Association excluded Jews from the legal profession. In 1938, the Journalists' Union excluded Jews from membership. As Father Marian Wisniewski wrote in Pro Christo in 1939, "We do not condemn everything the Nazis do, least of all their vigorous self-defense against the Jewish plague." And for good measure, he added, "The question of the blood libel accusation has never been fully resolved." March 1938, the Polish government announced the citizenship law, which revoked the passports of Polish citizens who had lived abroad for more than 5 years. While not explicitly targeted at the Jews, every dog in the street knew that this law was aimed at the Jews. Tens of thousands of Polish Jews living in Germany, including my own grandparents, faced the prospect of being declared stateless. Nazi Germany had absolutely no intention of being stuck with these stateless Jews, and so on October the 28th, 1938, the SS and the Gestapo arrested 15,000 Polish Jews living in Germany, including my grandfather, and escorted them to the Polish border, where a surprise awaited them because the Polish border guards, under instructions from the government, did not allow these Polish Jews back into Poland. And for several months through the winter, the Jews languished in a railway siding called Zbądzik. And it was from Zbądzik that Herschel Greenspan's sister wrote to him in Paris, describing the terrible conditions in the makeshift camp. Herschel's response was to assassinate the third secretary of the German embassy in Paris, which sparked the bloody pogrom known as Kristallnacht on November the 9th, 1938, the date that many historians mark as the true beginning of the Holocaust. In the face of centuries of this Polish anti-Semitism, the Jews of Poland had coined a Yiddish phrase. Die Polacken haben reingenommen hasen Jiden mit de Mammes Milch. Those of you who don't know Yiddish, that means the Poles absorbed their hatred for Jews with their mother's milk. I believe that this mother's milk came directly from the Polish Catholic Church dairy. In my talk today, I want to examine the legacy of church anti-Semitism in Poland through 3 incidents in living memory. The 1941 Jedwabne massacre, the 1946 Kielce pogrom, and the 1980s Auschwitz convent scandal. So we will start with Jedwabne. Under a secret clause in the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, I've spent the last couple of days at the fascinating, what's it called? Festival of History in Dublin Castle. And it's been amazing. And 2 different speakers actually spoke about the non-aggression pact. So, Under a secret clause in this non-aggression pact, Germany overran the western parts of Poland, and of course the Soviet Union invaded and took over the eastern parts of Poland. In June 1941, as part of Operation Barbarossa, when Nazi Germany invaded Soviet Russia, the invasion, of course, started in one part of the line with the reclaiming of the eastern part of Poland that had been under Russian rule for 22 months. Within a month, the Germans reached the small town of Jedwabne. These Nazi invaders were mindful of the directive issued by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office. And this is what he said: "No obstacle should be placed in the way of aspirations towards self-cleansing in anti-communist or anti-Jewish circles in the newly occupied territories. Rather, such aspirations should be provoked without leaving traces, and if need be, they should be intensified and led onto the right track. The aim is to produce popular local pogroms." In Jedwabne on July the 10th, 1941, there was no shortage of locals who advocated the self-cleansing of the Jews. The Catholic citizens of Jedwabne first forced their Jewish neighbors to break up a statue of Lenin and to run around the marketplace carrying its pieces while singing, "The war is our fault." The townsfolk of Jedwabne then herded some Jews into a barn, shot them, and threw them into a pit. They rounded up the remaining Jews, drove them into the barn, doused it in gasoline, and set it alight. Within minutes, nearly all the town's Jews, hundreds of them, from infants to old people, were burned alive, and the few who escaped or who had hidden were tracked down and butchered. That day, the 1,500-strong Jewish community in Jedwabne ceased to exist. And that same day, Jedwabne's citizens went on a looting rampage, robbing Jewish homes of silverware, furs, and furniture, and they also moved into the homes of their Jewish neighbors that they had known since childhood. Despite these verifiable facts, the people of Jedwabne successfully nurtured the myth that it wasn't the Poles who had perpetrated the massacre, it was the Germans. Indeed, a 1949 trial convicted 12 ethnic Poles for collaborating with the Germans in the massacre. It took almost 60 years before this myth was shattered in the year 2000 by historian Jan Gross. Some of you will remember his amazing talk in Trinity a few years ago. In Neighbors, the destruction of the Jewish community in Jedwabne, Poland, Professor Gross blames the massacre of the Jews squarely on the non-Jewish citizens of Jedwabne. The hysteria, denial, and countercharge that greeted Gross's book persuaded Polish journalist Anna Bikont to come to Jedwabne in 2001 to investigate the massacre and to write a book about her findings. Her first shock was to discover that the Catholic Church in Jedwabne was openly distributing copies of the protocols of the elders of Zion, and I remind you, we are talking about the 21st century. Bikont combed through archives and interviewed residents who survived the war period, and she published a book called The Crime and the Silence, a portrait of a Polish town that refused to accept a horrific truth. Her investigation validated all of Gross's claims that the Catholic citizens of Jedwabne had bludgeoned, knifed, drowned, and incinerated their Jewish neighbors. Using the townspeople's own words to demolish their claim of innocence, Beacon shows that virtually all of Jedwabne knew who the leading murderers were. These truths were passed down for decades in hints and whispers at kitchen tables and over rounds of vodka. The local Catholic priest, Father Edward Orlowski, who was 10 years old at the time of the massacre, threatened to excommunicate any Jedwabne parishioner who agreed to speak to Anna Beacon. Beacon quotes an eyewitness who was also 10 years old when she saw her fellow Poles driving their Jewish neighbors into the barn. "I can't sleep at night. I see it as if it were yesterday, that terrifying scream that probably didn't last for more than 2 minutes. It's still inside me." Beacon also tells us about a woman, Antonina Wirikowska, who saved 7 Jews during the war by hiding them under the pigsty and the chicken house, and she sprinkled gas around the pigsty to prevent the dogs, the tracker dogs that the Germans brought with them searching for hidden Jews, and it prevented them from sniffing out the Jews. When the war ended, members of the Polish Home Army came to visit Antonina in her home and brutally beat her because she had sheltered Jews from the Nazis. In the eyes of Jedwabne, Antonia had committed a shameful act. She had rescued Jews. Even before Beacon's book was published in 2004, the Polish government gave sufficient credence to the massacre that it chose to hold a ceremony in Jedwabne in 2001 to mark the 60th anniversary of the burning. But although Polish President Kwasniewski described the Jedwabne massacre as genocide, Polish president this is, the townspeople of Jedwabne followed the lead of the Catholic Church and boycotted the ceremony. Along the road leading to the ceremony, young men shouted about Yids, made obscene gestures, and blared loud music to drown out the speeches. Antonina, who was awarded Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations, was too frightened to attend the ceremony. 3 of the men who had beaten her up in 1945 were still living nearby. Just a few years before the 2001 ceremony, the Jewish-born former UK Labour Party leader Ed Miliband accompanied his mother back to the Polish shtetl where she was born. As they were leaving her former home, a man appeared and started shouting, "The Jews are returning to take back their property." The fear that Jews would have the chutzpah to reclaim their property was also a factor in the 1946 Kielce pogrom. By July 1946, 15 months after the end of the war, there were some 200,000 Jews gathered in Poland. Polish Jews who had survived the Holocaust by hiding or by joining Polish or Soviet partisans, that is, those who hadn't been killed by the same partisans, Jews repatriated from the Soviet Union, Jews repatriated from Germany and from other countries. Polish Jews who returned to their hometowns found their homes looted, destroyed, or occupied by new tenants who were not exactly delighted to welcome them back. Anti-Jewish riots broke out in several Polish cities. Hundreds of Jews were murdered in anti-Jewish violence, but the most notorious incident was in Kielce, which before the war had already seen Jews attacked and murdered in the street. Practically all of the 24,000 Jews of Kielce were transported to Treblinka, Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and by the time the Soviet army liberated Kielce in January 1945, there were only 2 Jews left. During the course of 1945, several dozen Jews returned to Kielce. In December 1945, the Jews held a Hanukkah celebration in the local Jewish community headquarters on number 7 Planty Street. Polish neighbors threw a grenade into the building. When the Polish Jewish Community Council called on the Bishop of Kielce to tell his flock to stop attacking Jews, he refused. By the spring of 1946, some 200 or so Holocaust survivors had returned to Kielce, including my two great-uncles, brothers Izzy and Yanky Fachler, who had somehow survived the death camps. It has been a feature of Christian Europe for several hundred years that Pesach and Easter are the season when rumors were rife of Jews using the blood of murdered Christian children to make matzot for Pesach. Sure enough, on the eve of Pesach, 1946, after the death of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, a poster appeared in Kielce warning parents to watch their children. According to the poster, a Jewish rabbi had been caught in a synagogue wearing, of course, a blood-stained white cloak with, of course, a girl who had been stabbed to death hanging beside him. When Dr. Joseph Tenenbaum, the president of the American Federation of Polish Jews, asked the primate of the Catholic Church in Poland, Cardinal Chlond, who we came across earlier, to refute the blood libel, he refused. The Poles do not murder Jews as Jews. They just retaliate for the murder of the Christian population by the Jewish communist-run Polish government. And as long as the Jews continue to rule, there will be trouble and the people will retaliate. Now just listen carefully to the Cardinal's language. Yes, he says, Christian Poles are murdering Jews, but it's okay. They're not murdering them because they're Jews. Just 4 weeks after these incendiary remarks, on July the 4th, 1946, an 8-year-old Kielce Christian boy claimed that he had been kidnapped, imprisoned in a cellar, and maltreated by Jews in the building on Planty Street, the Jewish community building. By 11 a.m., a vicious lynch mob had gathered outside the building. Civilians and militiamen, later joined by an army unit from Warsaw, began systematically murdering all the Jews in the building. That day, between 42 and 72 Jews, including my great-uncles Izzy and Natan, were murdered in what is now known as the Kielce pogrom, and a further 70 to 100 people were injured. At the funeral of the Jewish victims, Colonel David Kahana, the chief rabbi of the Polish army, charged the Catholic Church with complicity. Priests of the Polish people, Polish intelligentsia, people of Poland, can you leave this place with a clear conscience saying, our hands did not shed this innocent blood and our eyes did not see it? What have you done since the liberation in order to enlighten the masses who have been poisoned with Nazism? Polish bishops, where is your pastoral letter in regard to this? And in an echo of Shylock's words in The Merchant of Venice, Colonel Kahana asked, does the commandment, thou shalt not kill, not apply to Jews? It will come as no surprise that Cardinal Chlond refused to condemn the Kielce massacre, saying that it was the Jews' own fault, since the Jews were all communists or supporters of communism. The medieval-style Kielce pogrom delivered stark and conclusive proof to the Jews now in Poland that Jewish communal life in Poland was no longer viable. By 1948, over 100,000 Jews had left Poland through the clandestine Bricha flight organization which brought them to Israel. A further 50,000 Jews would leave between 1957 and 1959, which was the next wave of anti-Semitism, in a country with so few Jews. And in 1959, one of my father's only remaining relatives from the Holocaust period also left Poland, and about 15,000 of the remaining Jews left Poland in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when, again, you can just look at the figures. When we're talking about 15,000 Jews in a country of 30+ million, but it was still thought that there needed to be a nationwide, state-sponsored, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist campaign. Bless you. Before we turn to the third incident, the Auschwitz convent scandal, I just want to give a little bit of background. It is an undeniable historical fact that anti-Semitic Poland suffered badly from anti-Semitic Nazi Germany during World War II, and I don't want anyone to feel that I'm glossing over the scale of the decapitation of Poland's intelligentsia. The Germans did it, and of course so did the Russians. That's the Katyn massacre. However, since the end of the war, the Polish Catholic press has presented the Poles as the most victimized people of the war. I will repeat that. The Polish Catholic press has consistently presented the Poles as the most victimized people of the war. And for decades, the fate of Poland's 3 million Jews in the Holocaust simply didn't figure in the narrative of the Polish Catholic Church. And then, in 1984, Cardinal Marszewski, Archbishop of Krakow, decided to establish a Carmelite convent on the site of the Auschwitz death camp in a building originally used to store poison gas. For the Poles, Auschwitz was not a symbol of Jewish martyrdom, it was a synonym for the martyrdom and extermination of Catholic priests, of Catholic Poles, sorry. The insensitive decision to place a convent in Auschwitz sparked alarm bells in the international Jewish community. And it was at the height of the Auschwitz convent controversy that Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir weighed in with the age-old Yiddish expression about Poles imbibing anti-Semitism from their mother's milk. Shamir had first-hand knowledge of this when his father escaped from a death train and sought shelter with Polish farmers who were his childhood friends. They murdered him for his trouble. Coming back to the convent, the Polish Catholic Church was not swayed by the international outcry, even when 800 Belgian Catholics signed a petition requesting the removal of the convent. The nuns refused to accept the petition. Pressure from West European Catholic leaders in 1987 did lead to an agreement to move the Carmelite nuns to a new site within 2 years. But as the 1989 deadline approached, the convent had not been moved, and to add insult to injury, the nuns had erected a 22-foot cross in the convent garden. The British Board of Deputies was so incensed by this that they called for prayers to be recited in every synagogue in Britain. A firebrand American rabbi, Avi Weiss, whom I first met in the late 1960s and who's still making a lot of waves in the Orthodox Jewish world, organized his own private protest. He dressed himself in concentration camp garb, and he and 6 colleagues scaled the walls of the convent, blew the shofar, and said Kaddish. Polish workmen at the site poured a bucket of water mixed with urine on the protesters as the nuns watched from the windows. Cardinal Marszewski was so disgusted by what Avi Weiss had done, that he cancelled the agreement to move the nuns. The Archbishop of Warsaw, Cardinal Glemp, in a sermon to a congregation of 100,000, including the Polish Prime Minister, called on the Jews not to talk to us from the position of a superior nation. Don't you see, esteemed Jews, that openly opposing the Carmelite nuns hurts the feelings of all Poles and violates our hard-won sovereignty? Jews opposing the convents hurts the feelings of the Poles. What a cynical perversion of history. The following week, Glemp said that the agreement to move the convent had been made by church officials who were not competent to make such an agreement. Suppose someone came to your home and ordered you to move a wardrobe. You would be justified in answering, "Stupid, that's not your property." Convent, wardrobe, whatever. And once again displaying a flagrant denial of any Jewish connection to the Auschwitz death machine, Glemp added, "Jews have to understand that nuns dedicating their lives in prayer near the place where Christians were martyred does not offend their feelings." It took another 4 years, on the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1993, before the Pope demanded that the nuns vacate the convent. But the Polish Church wasn't done yet. In 1995, they decided to open a church in Birkenau. Why not? Rabbi Weiss again joined the protesters. After a standoff with church officials, Weiss and the other protesters were arrested. At the police station, a doctor asked them to strip. You heard right. Within shouting distance of Auschwitz-Birkenau, a Polish doctor ordered Jews to strip. Rabbi Weiss yelled at him, "You mean you haven't stripped enough Jews in this place?" This afternoon we looked at 3 incidents that symbolize the attitudes of the Polish Catholic Church to the Jews. Now, in many respects, of course, the Polish Church was taking its cue from Rome. When Pope Pius XII addressed the College of Cardinals straight after the end of World War II, he spoke of the hundreds of priests and religious who died in Nazi concentration camps, and the Pope made no mention of the millions of Jews who were murdered. I think it's safe to say that while the Polish Catholic acorn did not fall far from the Vatican oak, the Polish Church acorn fell with a louder thud. So where does the Polish Catholic Church stand today? A recent national poll found that 63% of Poles still believe in a Jewish conspiracy. 23% of Poles still blame Jews for the murder of Jesus and still believe that Christian blood is used in Jewish rituals. Last year, the Polish Episcopal Conference issued a statement that on the face of it marked a new tone. The history of Polish Jews is an integral part of our country's heritage. We call on priests to launch initiatives to preserve the memory of Jewish communities in the areas where they lived, and we ask the faithful and local authorities to help them out with this task. The statement admitted that the Nazi genocide of Jews on Polish soil was sometimes met with indifference among certain Christians. But I think it would be premature to conclude that this signifies a dramatic change in church hostility to the Jews, as we see from the continuation of the statement. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ, still what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. In other words, the Jews are guilty of deicide, but let's not blame the Jews of today. Well, isn't that a big relief? The statement continued. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. I'm going to leave it to others to refute this blatant example of replacement theology. Another disturbing sign in contemporary Poland is the fact that the Polish hierarchy has consistently refused to close down the notorious Catholic Polish radio station Radio Maria, which the Council of Europe has accused of openly inciting anti-Semitism. And very interestingly, earlier this month, the priest who runs the station, Father Tadeusz Rydzik, visited the Israeli embassy in Warsaw. It remains to be seen whether this will lead to any softening of the station's anti-Semitic tone. At a political level, in the years following the downfall of the Soviet Union, Poland showed more introspection than many other former Soviet regimes. The Polish government maintains cordial relations with the Jewish state, and the two countries have even held joint cabinet meetings. Poland recently opened a Holocaust museum in Warsaw. In 2003, Poland allowed Israeli Air Force F-15 jets to stage a symbolic flypast over Auschwitz. Professor Shevach Weiss, Israel's ambassador to Poland at the time, said, "The screech of the aircraft was the shout of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those whose ashes are at Auschwitz." Yet as we speak, there are worrying signs of a creeping mainstreaming of xenophobia and ultranationalism under Poland's Law and Justice Party. Confusing messages are coming out of Poland. The head of the party, Andrzej Sebastian Duda, Poland's president, recently attended the 70th anniversary commemoration of the Kielce pogrom. Yet the education minister recently insinuated on Polish TV that the Jedwabne massacre was a matter of opinion. As some of you may be aware, the Polish government has recently passed legislation making any reference to Polish death camps punishable by 3 years in prison. According to Poland's justice minister, it wasn't our mothers nor our fathers who are responsible for the crimes of the Holocaust, which were committed by German and Nazi criminals on occupied Polish territory. Under the proposed law, Jan Grabowski, who has just written The Role of the Blue Police in the Extermination of the Polish Jews, can be expected to be imprisoned if he ever visits his native Poland. Young people will now think twice before even studying Jewish-Polish relations, warns Grabowski, who noted that teaching and research jobs are already scarce in Poland, where government-funded universities are the major employer. Ladies and gentlemen, today we looked at the anti-Semitic legacy of Poland's Catholic Church. We looked at 3 incidents that symbolize this troubled legacy, a troubled legacy that manifested itself yesterday when I received hate mail from a Polish gentleman in Ireland who objected to my talk here today. I think we have to conclude that the Polish Catholic Church, as well as Polish society and the Polish state, still have a way to go before we can say that anti-Semitism no longer flows in Polish mothers' milk. Thank you very much.